Good afternoon. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to the John Locke Foundation, where our mission is to make North Carolina first in freedom. And we do that through three different activities, really. And I know that many of you have been touched by them. We have our outreach area, we have our research area, and also our journalism area. So if you have not yet visited our websites, I would encourage you to do so. carolinajournal.com, all of our journalism is there. And then also johnlocke.org, where we have all of our research. By the way, we do have a new research report out, so please do visit johnlocke.org. This is called Freedom in North Carolina. We have some new rankings, and our research staff has gone through and really taken a look at how North Carolina has progressed over the last several years based on different national rankings. You're going to see a reflection, an improvement, a definite trend, more freedom in North Carolina. And of course, our mission, we do that with the help of you, our mission is to continue down that road to freedom. And that's why we spend so much time at the legislature talking to them about policy ideas and solutions for North Carolina that give us all more choices, more options, more opportunities, and ultimately more economic growth. So thank you for being here. Anybody watch the Oscars last night? How would you like to be Warren Beatty today? Very interesting. I'm glad you're here. I do not want to be the person probably right about now in California at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Would you predict someone is probably to be fired today from that organization? But as someone who does live radio, I have to say when I really saw and heard what happened, I did feel for them, because not only is that a fiasco, but that happens in live situations, and unfortunately for them, it happened to them. John?
Have they found a way to blame Donald Trump for that?
I haven't checked in, but that might be a possibility coming up. Who knows? So I would just say to all of you who maybe don't share Hollywood's ideology as I don't, at first I chuckled a bit, but remember, things like that do happen, and for those of us who work in that kind of business, it was a cringe-worthy moment. I did indeed feel for them.
Hey, Steve Harvey's looking pretty good.
There you go. Yeah, he's the winner today, right? Steve Harvey. So, all right. Well, we have quite a march set up here at the John Locke Foundation. So I wanted to take a minute just to go over some of the presenters that we have scheduled for you. Hope that you will all come back every single week, because believe me, you don't want to miss one of these folks. Coming up next week, we're going to have Dick Carpenter from the Institute for Justice, a national organization. He's going to be talking about a new book that he co-wrote. It's called Bottleneckers, Gaming the Government for Power and Private Profit. So he's going to go over how different industries have managed to keep other people out and make some money and hook up with the government to do that. It's a fascinating new book. We want you to come and join us for that. On March 13th, then, we're going to do something extra special. You know, every now and then we have a panel forum on a particular subject, and we are doing that on March 13th. It's about mens rea reform. That's a Latin term, but essentially it's about overregulation, and we're going to look at questions of whether or not overregulation, particularly in North Carolina, can turn ordinary people into criminals, where there are lots and lots of rules and regulations that people can not even be aware of when they're working in industry, and then when they run afoul of that, they can actually get a criminal conviction. We've got an incredible panel set up for that. It's going to be held over at Campbell Law, like we do now and then. We're going to have a boxed lunch with that, $10 to attend that. You can go online to get your ticket for that. It's going to be a very interesting day, so looking forward to that. On March 20th, a new presenter, Tevi Troy. Actually, Mitch Kokai, if Mitch is in the room, he could probably tell us. Tevi, I believe, has been a presenter here a few years ago. But Tevi Troy is with the American Health Policy Institute, but is going to talk about this, a book, Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office. That should be fascinating as well. And then we will end the month on March 27th with something near and dear to many of our hearts. I think Nan Miller will appreciate this. Restoring Classical Liberalism in the Liberal Arts College. The case of the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. Tom Cushman from Wellesley will be joining us. Happy to say that one of our investors in freedom here at the Locke Foundation, Jane Shaw, helped us get together with Mr. Cushman. So he will be here at the end of March to talk about that. that brings us to today. I put on the table some copies of this magazine. The reason I did that is because our guest today, Ben Foster, came to the attention of Corey Swanson, our president and CEO, through this publication or one affiliated with this organization. And it is called the Property and Environment Research Center. So it's just a fascinating subject, and when I saw the description of this, I thought, boy, this is one we typically don't talk about. And Ben wrote this to us about his presentation. He said, when most people think about climate adaptation, they think of seawalls, they think of levees, dams, and other massive infrastructure projects that reduce our physical exposure to extreme weather. By focusing on reducing physical exposure, we often overlook another means by which we can adapt, using markets to manage our financial exposure. Today he's going to talk about that. He is a PhD student in environmental sciences and engineering at UNC Chapel Hill. Please welcome Ben Foster.
Alrighty, thanks Donna for the introduction. Can you guys hear me all right? There. I appreciate the opportunity to come here. I feel like I got a note from Corey and I looked up folks who have spoken at these before, and I feel like I somehow snuck in the back door of some vetting process. I'm not a professor, nor am I a person of significant influence in the public or private sector. But you've given me this podium, and now you're going to have to listen to a graduate student for the next 45 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have a good Q&A at the end. So I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing throughout my PhD, but I'm going to focus a little bit less on the technical side, which is looking at how we manage financial risks of drought on the Mississippi River. And I'm going to generalize it a little bit and talk about lessons that we've learned from this work. I don't know which way to point this out. So I'm going to anchor the talk to a statement here, a question, and try to work through answering this question. The question is, how can financial mechanisms help us better adapt to climate change? What I'm really interested, though, is in environmental variability. And that's actually impacted by quite a few more things than just climate change. There's land use change, population change. So I'm going to change the statement a little bit and talk about how we manage exposure to variable environmental conditions. So I do this for a couple reasons, but one of the main ones is that we experience variable environmental conditions already, and we have for a very long time. And we've done a lot of things to manage our risks associated with that. Those problems we expect are going to be more uncertain in the future, but we can learn quite a bit for how we deal with that variability and that uncertainty today and in the past, and that has lessons for how we might deal with increased variability in the future. So as Donna mentioned, I was a graduate fellow at PERC this past summer, where I did some of this work, and then they kindly published it in the PERC Reports edition you have on the table. Feel free to take those home. There are some very smart people that wrote very interesting things that are not myself that you would probably like to read. The edition here focuses on market adaptation to climate change. And the idea is looking at situations in which markets and property rights can produce adaptation and the conditions under which that happens. I'm looking at a kind of subset of that problem, and that's situations where historically we've used infrastructure to manage our exposure, and now we're seeing lots of innovation in financial tools, and that could change the way we make infrastructure decisions in the future. So I have looked at the Mississippi River for quite a few years now, and how corn marketers respond to drought there. But I'm going to spend the first half of this presentation on the tagline here, which is why financial adaptations could be as important, if not more, than physical adaptations. Okay, so we're going to go back to this anchoring statement here, and I'm going to kind of work backwards. So I'll start with variable environmental conditions, why we care, why it matters, and then work back towards what role financial tools might be able to play. So I'm an engineer by training. I'm not an economist, though I've learned how to argue with economists by spending time at PERC. And so I like to think about things in sort of systems engineering ways. So that's how I'm going to present them here. So we start with this environmental system that has some amount of natural variability and uncertainty. I often am referencing extreme events when we talk about this. The reason I put this up here is these are low probability, high impact events. Those events are very difficult to characterize even now. We don't have, in some cases, long enough historic records or descriptive enough historic records to really characterize what these events look like. They're tail risks. You might have heard that term before. Fat tails, you probably heard about it in reference to the financial crisis recently. And so these events are already difficult to describe, and we expect that our uncertainty about how bad they will be or how likely they will be is increasing. And so that brings me to this distinction between variability and uncertainty. Variability right, is natural variation. Uncertainty represents our inability to predict or measure something. And so in a lot of cases when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about increases in uncertainty. We're not sure if variability is going to get more or less and what's going to happen there. So that's an important distinction I just want to make up front here. And so we do know that there's this frequency of extreme conditions is increasing. So this is a figure from the Actuaries Climate Index, which is a group of actuarial industry groups have gotten together to create this. So these are folks who are exposed to these events, and they I'll explain this figure. So the red bars are mean there were a lot of extreme events in that particular year. This is covering low, high temperatures, rainfall, drought, wind, and sea level extremes. And so they calculated the number of events, and so this is in the US and Canada, I think. They've referenced it on this period here, so 1961 to 1990. You can see there's probably about an equal number of blue and red bars. But as we move forward, there's this increasing incidence of these extreme conditions, which is fine, and we might not care, but we do care because those extreme, or those resources that are kind of hitting those extremes are really valuable for a lot of things. So environmental resources are inputs to many economic activities. Here's a dam that's producing electricity. This dam also might be holding water that can be used, put into a drinking water system. It's important. Rain is important for crop growth. You can think of thousands of examples in which environmental resources and conditions are inputs to production. And they also enable economic activity. So this is the barge example. If water levels aren't maintained, a barge won't float. If a barge won't float, you can't move stuff down the Mississippi River. And they also impose costs and damages. So this is what we commonly think about. You can think about storm damage. This is a flood in which a bunch of barges weren't able to maneuver around this dam and got stuck. So this is damages to perhaps capital or other things. And so all of this kind of leads to some impact on our financial system. So we have some impact to cost and or revenues. And but I want to, one more note, it doesn't directly tie often to financial outcomes. We have these environmental conditions are filtered through from some production system, some economic system, and that produces our financial outcomes. And so these impacts are quite large. This is just one example. This is very, very extreme disaster type events. So it's one subset of what I'm talking about. And these are, so it's billion-dollar events by a year. These bars represent the number of events, so they're not particularly helpful. But this line here, which I've highlighted, is. And so this is the cost in billions of these events. And so we can see that they kind of range from $20 to $200 billion, depending on the year. So these things are quite costly. And people are recognizing this. So this was the outcome of a survey of both private and public actors who are exposed here, and they asked them, what things are you worried about? And there's all sorts of risks on here, but extreme weather kind of almost as consistently this year happens to be kind of the most people think it's the most likely and going to have the worst impacts, and it's consistently in that upper right quadrant here. Okay, so this is my reminder that we're talking about extreme events. So this is Roy Williams calling a timeout. If there are any college basketball fans out there, you know that this doesn't happen very often. I'm actually a Virginia fan. I saw a Virginia sweater come in. I'm excited about that. But so when this guy pops up, I'm going to take a break and kind of recap what's going on and take a sip of water. So this is the part of the statement we've covered so far, and hopefully you believe me and you see that environmental conditions are a driver of variability in financial outcomes. So the next step here is how we want to better manage our exposure. And we say this, right, that I need a reference point in order to say better, and that reference point is generally infrastructure. So this is what we've done for a really long time when we're exposed to these variable conditions. We use concrete and rebar in engineered systems in order to tamp down that variability and improve our financial outcomes here. So infrastructure smooths out natural variability. So this is a dam holding, this is actually the Hoover Dam holding back Lake Mead. Right? This is essentially in the desert. Right? So it doesn't rain very often. What we do is we collect all that water into a large reservoir, and then we have access to that water throughout the year. We can dole it out as we need it. And so we've smoothed out that natural resource variability by building this dam. This is a lock and dam on the Mississippi River. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is what locks and dams do. So this is the length of the Mississippi, the upper Mississippi. So this is up in Minnesota, and that's down in St. Louis. And so we build these locks and dams in order to regulate the level of the river. If we can regulate the level of the river, we can reliably move goods up and down the river. So those are the dams kind of hold the water back, and the water spills over if it gets high enough. The locks allow the barges to get lowered down and keep moving along this section of the river. Okay, so how have we made these decisions in the past? Generally, it's benefit cost analysis. In some cases, this is legally a legal requirement, depending on who's making the decision. In these analyses, at least the part I will highlight, actually I'll give a little more background. So essentially, you sum up the net benefits, net costs. If the ratio is greater than 1, it presumably has net benefits, and so that's how we allocate resources in infrastructure decisions. The benefits, though, are not as kind of clear as one might think, and so they're calculated using with and without project conditions. So to illustrate this, I have this time series of, we'll say, profits here. Say that's what we're measuring this in. You can see this time series of without, so this is the baseline. So this would be no project, and you can see there was this period, we'll say, of drought here that caused a drop in profits. You could imagine with the project, you might smooth out that drop. The benefits of that project would be this area underneath. The problem is we don't live in worlds in which we can both do infrastructure and not do infrastructure. And so both of these lines are modeling exercises. In some cases, we have a long historic record that allows us to characterize this without line pretty well. In some cases, we don't. But either way, we're making modeling choices here. When you're making modeling choices, you're inevitably going to be making some assumptions. And so I'll get into why this is important, but financial adaptations has important implications for this problem right here. And that's because these models of without project conditions and with project conditions depend on market activity, right? They depend on how people react to being exposed to this new risk. And if you're not able to capture how they make these decisions, you're going to be probably overvaluing these types of projects. Okay, so we got Roy Williams again. So I'm going to get some water. Okay, so we've gone one step further. I've anchored this better management statement here with infrastructure, and they're the commonly identified and used solution, but they rely on models and predictions. So the extent to which it's difficult to make predictions or we can't capture behavior, we might be making over or under investments in infrastructure. Okay, so moving on to financial mechanisms. Okay, so what about financial adaptation? This bubble kind of alludes to where it's going to pop in. So these financial adaptations kind of enter into the bottom half of this figure here. When environmental risk presents itself as price risk, we can use things like commodity futures, derivatives, and pricing. And so I'm going to go into what I mean by this. So in some cases, environmental risks look a lot like a lot of other economic risks. And economic risks, we have pretty well-developed methods and markets and tools to manage our exposure to exogenous shocks in a market. These are things like commodity futures contracts. So for those unfamiliar with what these might be, it would be, say I'm in St. Louis and someone is down in New Orleans and I want to move my corn down to New Orleans and sell it to them. But I don't want to take the risk that in 2 months, when I do move it down there, the price of corn is going to have gone way down or gone way up. So I'll enter into a contract that says, we'll agree on the price today, and I will give you corn in 2 months, and I will deliver that corn to you, and I avoid all the price risk, and whoever is purchasing my corn down in New Orleans accepts that price risk. And so if prices go down and they're locked in to buy the corn at $5 a bushel, prices are at $3 a bushel, they're kind of out of luck. They have to pay the $5. The extent to which those prices reflect environmental conditions, these tools are really good at handling environmental risks. And this turns out to be what we found on the Mississippi River. And so that's one half of this puzzle. There are kind of commonly used tools that work pretty well in some cases. The other thing that can happen here is you can change how you act, right? So the adaptation kind of problem is this, right? If we pick you up and we drop you in Antarctica, you're not going to freeze to death. You're going to buy a coat. That's costly to you. You have to buy a new coat, but you've adapted to the new weather conditions there. And you've avoided kind of these worst case outcomes. Same thing happens when we have disruptions in economic systems due to environmental conditions. So say barges are stopped from moving on the river. You're not just going to put your corn on the river and force it down at really high cost, or it's going to get delayed and you're not going to be able to make it down the river. You're going to put it in storage. You're going to sell it into upstream markets. You're going to do something else. So you can change your marketing strategies that help you avoid these really bad outcomes. And then the other side of this puzzle is, in some cases, environmental risk is a very specific risk and expresses itself in ways that don't lend it to being managed by traditional financial and economic tools. And so we've developed in the past decade, there's been a proliferation of these kind of more unique tools. So catastrophe bonds you might have heard of, index insurance. So that's an insurance contract indexed on a particular environmental variable. And there's weather derivative contracts out there. And so these tools are built for very specifically to address environmental risks. And so the reason we want to think about what kinds of things we can do from a financial perspective is they're going to impact the way we make infrastructural decisions. So I mentioned this figure before. You can imagine if this without line was described without accounting for how the market would react to shocks, it might be too low. You might actually see this line, which would reduce the benefits of a project to the extent to which that crosses that one line, right? Those benefits are less than the cost of the project. We might decide not to build an infrastructure project. Another reason it matters is because of flexibility. Infrastructural decisions are long-term decisions that are susceptible to both over and under design. So if you need to make a specification for a dam that's going to last for 50 years, you're going to make some projection about both environmental conditions in 50 years, but also land use conditions in 50 years and population in 50 years. All of those projections have uncertainties around them, and we expect that those uncertainties, at least on the climate side, are going to be increased. And so we're making decisions about how to spec a dam based on something that we're quite uncertain about. So if actual conditions deviate from our design conditions, we've either over or under designed our dams, and they're very difficult to modify. It's very difficult in most cases to modify infrastructure projects, and so it's costly if we misdesign these projects. On the financial side, there's kind of flexibility benefits, and so I'd say here, harnessing the power of prices. Prices can communicate these local conditions and capture updated expectations about the future. So as we step forward in time and we learn more things about what we expect the future to look like, prices can change to reflect that, and then they can coordinate market responses. So should we change our marketing strategies? Should we use more hedging instruments? Or should we invest in more capital or less capital into our whatever industry we're in? Okay. So the story here is that financial adaptation and the extent to which we can identify it and it can improve in its effectiveness could affect, or probably will affect, how we make infrastructural decisions, and could overall improve our ability to adapt to these to new environmental conditions in the future. Oh, there it is. And additionally, financial adaptation is increasingly attractive when there's uncertainty, right? It's this risk of over and under design that we don't have with financial tools. And so the extent to which financial adaptations can push infrastructure projects into the future. You can imagine being a water utility trying to decide if this is happening in the triangle area. Should we build new resources, build a new dam so we have more water supply? There's tools you can use to kind of offset the financial risks in order to push that decision into the future, in which case you might know more about what the future is looking like and you could make a better investment at that time. Okay, so all of that pretty theoretical, and I think it'll be useful now to show you the work we've done on the Mississippi and how that plays into the story. So I will mention a couple co-authors on this work. One is Craig Taraklis, who's my advisor, and Wally Thurman, who's over at NC State in the econ department, has worked with me through PERC on a lot of this work. So this is the 2012 US drought. And you can see, it's going to start over here. As we got into the middle of the summer, the drought kind of just settled into the Midwest US. And it turns out that's where we grow corn, and that's also what feeds the Mississippi River. It lasted for about 8.5 months and impacted quite a few things, including corn production. So I think about 87% of US corn producing counties experienced moderate drought or worse during 2012. The green shows where we grow corn, it's major growing areas, and the red shows the extent of the drought. So you can see basically everywhere we grew corn was pretty largely impacted by the drought. And that means we produced a lot less corn. So we produced 27% less corn than we expected upon harvest. And so the reference number there is the USDA's expectation at planting. So they know how much seed goes into the ground. They make an estimate of how much corn we're going to have. And we were 27% low, which is a huge number. That's usually a quite predictable thing. So the other thing that happened is related to the Mississippi River. So this figure shows annual freight tonnage across the U.S. for different modes of transportation. You can see the river highlighted there in the middle. You can also see, I think this is interesting, it's a side story. You can see that rail, that really thick rail line. Does anyone know what that's from? That's Gillette, Wyoming. That's where it comes out of. It's coal, a lot of coal that's headed east. Low sulfur coal. So anyways, back to the Mississippi. You can see it's quite an important transportation resource. That is particularly true for low value to volume ratio goods. So a lot of agricultural products that take up a lot of volume or are quite heavy, but they're worth dirt, basically. That's the joke, 'cause corn is essentially worth dirt. And so transportation costs have a big impact or a big percentage of the cost of producing corn. This slide is a little bit misformatted, but the Mississippi is not a natural system. So it is highly engineered, has been highly engineered for a long time. We've already made lots of infrastructural investments on the river. That's the locks and dams I talked about before. Here's one under construction in 1923, I think. No, 1935. And we've done a lot of other things. We use levees to control flooding. There's an old river control structure down in Mississippi, Louisiana, that keeps the river going out in New Orleans. Otherwise, the river would naturally divert along the bayou, I believe. And then there's locks and dams, as I mentioned before, that regulate the river north of St. Louis. But despite all of that, there's a Mark Twain quote. He said a lot of things about the Mississippi River, so you can find anything you want to say about the Mississippi River. Mark Twain probably said it. He said, the Mississippi River will always have its own way. No engineering skill can persuade it to do otherwise. And so the story there is, despite all of this activity to remove the variability in water levels in order to provide a reliable navigation resource in the U.S., we're still susceptible to fluctuations in water supplies. And we can see that in 2012. So at various times, the river levels got so low that barge transportation was dramatically impacted. So the worst place seemed to be Thieves, Illinois, which is just south of St. Louis. And it might be hard to see, but you can see in this tail here, this red line is the 80th percentile or 20th percentile of discharge. And so the discharge on the river got extremely low, and it got to the point that barges were impacted. So this is how a barge could be impacted by low water levels. Here's a full barge sitting in the river, and what matters is this distance between the bottom of the barge and the bottom of the river. If you get too close, you risk running aground, which is very, very expensive and you don't want to do. So if the water levels drop below a certain threshold, you have to do something called light loading. So that's less volume per barge that you move down the river, which increases the cost of barge transportation. And then the other thing is channel width. And so as the river channel narrows, barges, if you're unfamiliar, aren't self-propelled. We lash them together, and then we take a towboat, and surprisingly, we take a towboat and push them down the river. And so if you narrow the channel, you can't get around a corner, you have to reduce the number of barges per towboat. So that's another reduction in efficiency.
Why do you push instead of pull? You know?
I think steering. I think it's easier to steer if you're pushing. You have to be pushing faster than the flow of the river. If any of you have driven a boat in the ocean, if you get caught in a wave, you lose control of your boat. So you have to be moving faster than the river is moving, and I'm pretty sure it's easier to steer if you're pushing than if you're pulling. It would be cool to go ride on one of these and find out what they do. And I think it takes 18 days to go from St. Louis to New Orleans, something like that. I could be wrong about that number, but. So here illustrates how this played out in 2012. So this is 2011, river levels were normal. I'm gonna flip back and forth between two figures. And if you look at the bends in the river, you can really see how much narrower it got. I'm gonna try to flip back and forth, there we go. So that's 2011 to 2012. These are NASA images, and you can see the river getting quite a bit narrower, especially, this is actually a good spot down here. Oh. And so there were major disruptions of barge transportation. The Coast Guard restricted barge operations for over 6.5 months to varying levels and at varying locations. So here's the question I wanted to answer. We know drought caused two things. It disrupted barge navigation. It also reduced corn harvest. Those are kind of two separate shocks to production costs of corn. And we wanted to understand how corn markets responded to these conditions. And if we could identify places in which they responded well to limit their losses, or if they could have just been highly exposed to these fluctuations. Forward prices, so forwards are these contracts that are risk management related. We saw, something's missing on that slide. So with forward prices, we saw evidence that these contracts were being used to mitigate environmental risk. So their prices were moving prior to the disruptions, the environmental disruptions, which reflect people's expectations that there were going to be disruptions in the future, and then they use these contracts to manage their exposure to those future disruptions. And I haven't shown price data here because this is work still in preparation. And so I'm tentative to show sort of too much there until it's private data that has been helpful to us, but I want to keep that private for now. So that's the end of the story. So the Mississippi River, we see this evidence that these markets were pretty adaptable in the face of an environmental shock, and that both spot prices and forward prices reflect this risk management activity happening on a private level. And that has implications for those engineering models that weren't quite capturing this behavior and that were being used to make decisions about infrastructure investments on the Mississippi.